So what's new in interactive dialogues? And then at the very end of the session today, we'll have 3 or 4 pages on something called multiple dialogues as well. So we actually have 2 topics. One topic, though, is pretty short. There's only 3 or 4 pages. And as follows our usual agenda, we'll meet approximately an hour and a half. Some sessions seem to take a little bit longer than an hour and a half, and some sessions seem to take less time. So we just play it by ear. But none of the sessions will actually go longer than 2 hours. That's our absolute limit. If we need a break, we'll take one, a 10 to 15-minute break. I believe we've only had 1 break for these sessions so far. Most of the time we're able to wrap up in plenty of time where we don't actually need a break. So we'll see how it goes today, but I think we'll be fine without one. You can probably tell I have allergies today. We had a lot of rain last week here in Dallas, or this weekend. And every time it rains, I guess the mold always gets stirred up, so yours truly always has a little bit of trouble with allergies for a week or so after the rain. So it's unfortunate that it happened this weekend. So if I do need to cough, I'll try to make sure I mute my microphone so I won't cough in your ear. So during the training session, if you need to leave and rejoin later, you can do so anytime. It won't disturb anybody else here at the session. It won't disturb me. Every session is recorded, and I always try to get the link out there on the instructor-led training site the same day that we actually have the session. So it should be posted there this afternoon. So if you miss part of the session, you don't have to worry about it. You can just come back and click on that watch recording link, I believe is what we call it. And when you watch the recording, you can see the whole session that way. If you have any questions during the session, I think most of you are familiar with the chat interface. I've had chat messages from some of you during the sessions. So you can send me a message that way during the actual session, or you can send me an email later. So there's my email address down at the bottom, lchildress@4js.com. And I'll always get back with you. It just might take, in some cases, a few days. I did see that we had some new people in the session this week that haven't been here for one of the previous sessions. So I'll go ahead and go through this interface topic that gets you familiar with the interface we use for the sessions. This is your viewing area here. Let me grab a marker or a pen so I can point things out. This is your viewing area where you'll be able to see the slides for the presentation. And then you also have a control panel that has various icons in it. This one's to close the control panel. There's your mute button if you want to mute yourself. Usually that won't be necessary because I usually mute everyone before the session starts. Here's the raised hand icon that I asked you to use a few minutes ago so that I could make sure that the audio was working properly. And then down here at the bottom is the chat interface. So if you need to send me a chat, it's right there at the bottom. Here's a bigger screenshot with everything blown up in the control panel. I imagine I went through most of it except maybe just the audio part. Here at the very top, there is an audio option that you can use. If you're having trouble with the speakers on your computer, for example, you can use the telephone option. And if you click on that radio button, you should be able to see a telephone number that you can use to call in for the session. If that doesn't work, again, you don't need to worry about it because the sessions are recorded, so you can always come in and listen to the recording if you have problems with your microphone or speakers and you can't hear. So that was an abbreviated overview of the participant interface, but I think everyone is pretty familiar with interfaces like this. Okay. So here we are in our Interactive Dialogues chapter, and our first page is just an overview of the different interactive dialogue statements. So you can see from the list, menu, construct, display, display array, input, and input array are all probably familiar to you if you've done any 4GL programming or VDL programming. They've been around for a while. And there it's pointing out that these are high-level VDL statements that substitute for a lot of lines of code. So if you were going to go in, for example, and try to do this from scratch, it would probably be a pain. So that's what these interactive dialogue statements are all about, to save you a lot of coding and turn control over to the user to perform a common task. That's the thing they all have in common. So we have our menu statement that lets the user select from a list of action. We've got the construct that turns control over to the user to do a query by example, to enter database search criteria on a form and get results back. We've got the display and display array statement that lets users select information displayed from database tables. And then finally, the input and input array statement allows the user to insert, update, and delete data there in the form. So there's the interactive dialogue statements. You can call them interactive instructions or dialogues. We have several terms that you hear people use for them. So I guess the long term would be interactive dialogue statements. The first interactive dialogue statement we'll look at is the menu. It's probably the simplest to work with, so it makes a good one to start out with. So here's our menu statement. Grab a highlighter here. So the name of our menu is Customer. You can see that over here. It's kind of hidden by this arrow, but there's the name of the menu. We're using these on actions to allow the user to trigger actions based on buttons they click over here, in this case in the right-hand pane. And then finally at the bottom we have the exit menu. So the menu statement is just an interactive instruction that defines all the possible actions or options that a user can execute at a given place in a program. You can present menus in a variety of ways. By default, if you import a 4GL program into Genero, you'll see it pretty much just as we see here. Right? It'll end up being a menu panel on the right-hand side. But you can change that. You might prefer to have the menu down at the bottom. You could put it up at the top. You may even prefer to get rid of the menu panel altogether and use, for example, a top menu or toolbars instead. So that's one of the, I guess, new enhancements, you could say, to the menu statement, is the idea that this whole menu panel can be replaced with top menus or toolbars. So that's one of the nicer options about it. So one thing that's important along with that is to notice that the idea of triggering an action doesn't have to be bound tightly to the code, right, or to the business logic like the old ring menus were. I can trigger this action query from a variety of places in the screen. I can query it from this button over here. I could also trigger that query action by using a toolbar or a top menu item. So any way I query or any way I trigger that query action will trigger the code that we have in this on action query block. So it's a little bit different from the construction that we might be familiar with the 4GL ring menu. It doesn't matter either, let me grab a different marker here, whether or not you use uppercase or lowercase letters for these action names, on action previous, on action next. Right, so the labels you use there are actually converted by the compiler to lowercase. So on action next in uppercase is the equivalent of on action next that we see here all in lowercase. So it really doesn't make any difference. The compiler takes care of that for us. Now if you're a 4GL programmer and come from a 4GL background, you might be more familiar with the command. Right? So the command also works instead of the on action blocks that we see here. With the command, the name is bound to the action, and you can specify also different text if you want to, just like you can with on action. And that's all just enhancements that we have with VDL, the Genero language. So you could use command or you could use on action. We prefer for you to use on action, but it's not actually required. You can get almost all the functionality with your command statements that you can get with the on action statements. All right, so I was just thinking, is there anything else exciting here? So essentially, the menu works the same way that it did with 4GL in that it's an interactive dialogue, but here it's just simply a list of actions, and the actions can be triggered from the menu or other ways in the interface. So it doesn't have to be triggered from the menu we see here. We could have other options as well. We could have a top menu, toolbar, and so on. So here's the syntax for the menu statement, just to kind of go through the syntax and look for things that were different from our 4GL environment. Here notice that the command option and command key are still supported, so if you're familiar with those are still there. They don't cause any problems with compiles. Here's the on action statement that we saw a minute ago in our example on the previous slide. And here's something new that we haven't talked about yet, the on idle statement, right? So on idle block, it's fairly self-explanatory. If the user's sitting in a menu dialog for a certain number of seconds that you can specify and he doesn't take any action, then this on idle is triggered and of course performs whatever code you put in the on idle block. We'll see an example of that in a minute. Down here at the bottom, we've got some menu statements that you can execute. I'll show you some examples of those too here in a minute. There's the continue menu, the exit menu. Notice down here a little further there's even the show option and hide option. If you were in the session a couple of weeks ago, we learned some, I think, more fluid or more efficient ways to show and hide actions by using those built-in classes and methods that we talked about a few weeks ago. But you can still do it here as well with the menu syntax. So to kind of summarize, the main new things here that maybe you're not familiar with 4GL would be the on action, on idle, the idea that the menu panel can be replaced with something like a top menu or toolbar. And one thing I haven't shown you yet is menus can be associated with a style. There's actually 2 or 3 styles that you can use with the menu. You configure the menu just like you always would, except you add this style attribute. The default style is called default, strangely enough. And they're showing you here that you can specify a different type of style called dialog that will actually bring up the menu in a dialog window, a separate window. There's also a pop-up style that will display more of a context menu versus a dialog type menu. Let's see here. This might be a good time to go ahead and show you a few of those. I'll go ahead and use my highlighter. Okay, in this, it won't let me use my highlighter right here. 1 second. I have to get back out of it. Let's see. Got a simple little application here called custQuery that has a few modules, custmain.4gl and custquery.4gl. And right here in our custmain, we have a menu, interactive dialog that we can look at. And notice we're using the on action blocks, on action query, on action next. And then down here kind of towards the bottom is the on idle we were just looking at in the presentation. So normally your on idle would specify a number of seconds that's more reasonable than 7 seconds, but for purposes of demoing it to you today, I went ahead and used just a small number of seconds. But normally you'd use 30 seconds or 60 seconds or some reasonable number to give the user time to actually maybe take a phone call, be able to get back in and still do some sort of menu selection. But for demo, we'll do on idle 7. So there's our menu. There's our on action blocks. And notice right here on action quit, we're actually going to call a function called getConfirm, pass them a string that has our question in it. Are you sure you want to exit? And we're going to use this function to determine whether or not the user actually wants to quit or not. So just to demonstrate one of these dialog type menus, this getConfirm function is right here in the the cust query module. Let's see if we can find it. It's down here at the bottom. So here's this function that we're going to call if the user selects the quit action. Here's where we're passing it in our comment text. Are you sure you want to quit? And then here's our menu. So notice we only have 2 different options for the users to select from here. We have command yes and command no. So these dialog type menus are nice for just simple yes or no responses from the user. Notice something else that we don't see an exit menu here. Exit menu is actually not required for a menu with a style of dialog or pop-up. They both are self-exiting, I guess you could say. As soon as the user selects an option in the menu, it automatically exits out of the menu. So that's another difference between the default menu style and then the pop-up and dialog style. So let's run this so you can get a look and see how that dialog menu looks. All right. So here's our application. Probably the first thing to show you will happen here in just a second. If you remember, we had an on idle, I believe it was on idle 7 in our menu, and there it went. Right, so I sat there for 7 seconds without making a selection, so it actually idled out. Right, the on idle action was triggered, and my on action that I wanted to perform was exit menu. So that's what I had in the block, the on idle block. So that was a quick demonstration. Let's try it again. And this time let's take a look at that dialog style that we talked about earlier. So to see that, I have to hit the quit option, and there it is. Right? As soon as I hit quit, it called that function, and the function had a dialog style menu with just 2 actions, or 2 commands in this case. There was a yes and a no. So if I say yes, it returns that response back to our on action quit, and we exit the menu. Pretty straightforward. Okay. That's about all I can think of that's exciting. Let me just show you one more thing, although I don't know how exciting that really is. Notice that if you click on the X up at the top of the window, most users are familiar with that red X being a way to actually close out of the window. So I should be able to hit the quit option or the red X, or at least most users would think so. But actually, get out of here, to be able to implement closing the window by the user clicking on that red X, I have to add another option or another action to my menu. So let me pop back over here into the cust main, and I'm just going to add another action. Find a good easy place to put it where I don't have to worry about throwing something else off. This looks good. I'm just going to say on action close. And then we'll say exit menu. Let's give that a try. Okay. Lois tells me there's a sound problem. Let me speak up a little bit. Is that better, Lois? Anyone else having any problems with the audio? Okay, thanks. I think the problem is, Aaron says keep getting bumped out of the meeting. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so Scott tells me we lost audio for about 1 minute. I think part of the problem is I lean forward so I can see the screen better. And when I lean forward to see the screen better, I think that might be part of what causes the audio problems. So I will try not to lean forward so much. We'll see if that helps. So what we were talking about here, if you lost audio for a minute, was when the user clicks on the red X in the corner of the window, they're expecting the menu to close, right? The window to close. But you have to add an action, on action close, to your menu, and then exit menu, add that to your on action close block, and then it should close. So let's take a look and see if that worked. So now we still have our quit option, quit action. That would take the same action. It would close the window. But now if the user clicks on the red X, notice our window closes. So that's actually a predefined action that you can use to specify close and then whatever action you want it to take. All right, so I think I've exhausted all of my interesting things about the menu interactive dialogue. The only other thing I can think of to show you would be the pop-up option. You might want to see that, so let's take a look at that real quick. It's very quick and easy to show you. If I can find my menu. There we go. So I'm just going to change the style for my menu from dialog to pop-up. Okay, we'll run it again. And this time when we quit, notice we don't get our dialog window, separate window. This time we get more of what I think of as a context type menu with yes or no. So that's the pop-up style. So we have our default style for menus, which is the normal style that we saw with the panel, for example, in the right-hand side. We have the dialog style that pops up the menu in a separate dialog. And then we have the actual pop-up style that we just saw that looks more like a context type menu. Okay, I think I've covered just about everything you would want to know about menus, so let's see what comes up next. All right, so the next interactive dialogue statement we'll look at is the construct that allows users to do the query by example to query for data. So the basic syntax is the same. We still use a variable, a program variable, like this where clause to hold the where clause selection criteria. So that part hasn't changed. Here's what's new with the construct. We have the same on idle block that we saw with the menu statement, so I won't actually probably demo that to you, but here's an example of it here on the slide. On idle 30, let timeout equal true, exit construct. You can also exit the program if you want to. So exit construct, exit program could both be used there. We have the same on action syntax that we saw in the menu a slide or so ago. And we also have an additional on action in field action that you can use where you can specify a specific field. Grab a highlighter here. So the only time this action will be available in this case is when the user is actually in this case, the customer city field. So I believe I can probably demo that too as well. Let's take a look here. I think we can use the very same application. I'll try not to lean forward so we lose audio this time. Let me see if I can see well enough. All right, so let's find our construct. And I believe it's here. On up. There it is. Okay, so here's our construct by name, where we're creating our where clause. Well, here's our on idle. So we can take a look at that. Just like we used with our menu statement a minute ago, you can also idle out of a construct just like you can a menu. So notice in this example I could say on idle 7 or on idle 30. Something more reasonable is what you should use. Exit construct. In this case I chose to exit the entire program. Let's see what else is interesting. So there's the on idle. Don't have an on action here, so let's just add one. All right, we'll put it right here above this on idle. Oops. There we go. So we'll just add it right here. So on action, we'll do zoom like they did in the example. On action zoom, so we're going to have an action called zoom. And we won't do anything exciting. We'll just say message zoom selected. All right. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So as soon as we get into the construct by hitting the query action, right, that puts us in our construct. Now we have our zoom action available. And notice that that zoom action is available in any field that the user enters. So he can select that zoom option anywhere in this construct. All right, so let's exit out of that and let's try something just a little different. Let's change this on action zoom to use the in field clause. So we'll say on action zoom, how about in field? Doesn't really matter for our purposes. We're not actually going to do anything. So we'll just say on action zoom, in field store name, message zoom selected. We'll see how it looks different now. So we'll get into our construct by selecting the query action. Notice our zoom action isn't available right now. All we have are OK and cancel actions. But as soon as we enter the store name field, now we can see that zoom. And that, of course, is because of that on action in field syntax. Whoops, I let it idle out. But anyway, you were able to see it, I'm sure. Okay. So that's about the most exciting things I can think of with the construct. Let's go ahead and go back and see what else is coming. On idle, on action, in field. So we took a look at all of those. All right, so the next interactive dialog statement we'll look at is the display. And it's just used, of course, to display data to a form. There's not really anything new about the syntax for display statement. If you're familiar with the display syntax, you can display by name, like we see here, if the variables that you're using in the program have the same name as the form fields in the form. If the variables don't have the same name as the form fields, you can use this display to syntax that you see down here at the bottom. So that part hasn't changed. So nothing really new to show you here with the display statement. So that puts us to display array. And display array has a lot of functionality that you may not be familiar with if you're coming from a 4GL environment. Display array, of course, by itself controls the display of a program array on the screen, but it's also the foundation of a lot of features that we'll be talking about in some of our other sessions. Multi-row select, drag and drop, tree views, those are all features that are implemented with this display array statement and some of the enhancements that Genero has made to the display array statement. So it has some new options as well. We've seen both of these before. On action, on idle are both supported by display array as well as the construct and menu interactive dialogs. So Not really a lot to look at there. We've seen those before. So something new and more interesting is what we call paged mode. So display array can now work in kind of a buffered mode. So to avoid loading a big array when you have a lot of rows to display, you can save memory, save traffic by doing it using this buffered mode. So the program array gets filled dynamically with data rows just when they're needed during the display array execution. So that feature is called paged display array, and the key to page display array is this on-fill buffer clause that you see right here. It's another trigger, essentially. So this on-fill buffer block is used to fill a page of rows in a dynamic array according to an offset and a number of rows. And something you can see here in this example is an on-fill buffer block with a couple of built-in functions that you can use to get that offset and the number of rows that are needed. So you don't have to do a lot of programming to be able to get that offset and length. It's all right here with these built-in functions. Now something else I'm going to point out since it's right here is if you're not sure of the number of rows that are available, you can use this attribute for display array, this count equal -1. And then this on-fill buffer will get triggered when rows are needed, and it will just keep trying to fetch rows and return rows until not as many rows are actually returned as it requests. So that's one way of letting it know, or that's how it knows that there's no more rows available. It figures out what the offset and the length should be and makes a request for rows, and not as many are returned as it actually requests. So that's what the count equal -1 does. It means you're not sure of the actual number of rows available. What else? Something else to talk about would be how this on-fill buffer gets triggered. So probably the easier thing to do would be just to show it to you. Let me get rid of my highlighter here for just a second. Let me find an application that actually uses it. Here we go. Here's a paged array application. Maybe before we see that, let's just do a regular display array so we can maybe see the differences. Oops, I'm leaning forward again. Hopefully I didn't lose you. I believe this one will work. Let's try this. Okay. All right, so here's a display array in this program that is not using this special buffered mode or paged mode that we're talking about. Everything's loaded ahead of time before we enter the dialog. One thing that we'll see here that's going to be different from the paged mode versus the static mode, we'll call it, is the ability to sort. Right? So if I click on any of these column headers, I can sort the data. So now if we go down and look at our paged array example, it's almost exactly the same, but this time what's going on underneath the covers is completely different. Right? We're not actually loading our data into the array until we actually do something to trigger that on-fill buffer clause that we saw a minute ago. So I can trigger that on-fill buffer clause by scrolling down with the scroll bar. Right, that's triggering it. I could also trigger the on-fill buffer by expanding the window. So that triggers it. But one thing that's different is notice that when I click on these column headers, I'm not able to sort. So we could say that that's a limitation of paged mode or paged display array, is when you use this buffered mode, you're not able to do this kind of on-demand sorting by clicking on the column headers. Let me see, I believe I've got a comment or a question. Let me take a peek here, just to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a question. Looks good. Okay, so that's paged mode or page display array and the on-fill buffer clause that we were focusing on. If we were going to actually look at this program, let me see if I can remember which one of these actually has it. I believe it's this one here. Let's take a look and see. Open. There we go. If we take a look, we should be able to see some of the syntax we're talking about. There it is, right? So here's the display array, and then right here is our on-fill buffer. There's our built-in functions we were just looking at that it's going to use to get the offset and the number of rows that's needed. So this just gets triggered, this on-fill buffer just gets triggered when the user does something, like use the scroll bar, expand the window, something of that nature. And then it goes out, gets the offset and the length that's needed, and then goes in and fetches the rows to display to the screen dynamically. All right. So that's paged mode or buffered mode, however you want to think of it, with the display array. Oh, okay. Something else that's a nice feature that's implemented with display array is a tree view. So that's another display array feature. So we can show the data as a tree view instead of a table. Most of us are familiar with seeing arrays displayed in a tabular format. But these tree views are implemented with display array, and you have an array, screen array, that's bound to a tree container with tree view specific attributes in the form. So tree containers are familiar and similar to table containers, except the only difference is the first columns are used to display a tree of nodes on the right side of a widget. So they're similar. They're not hard to implement. They look complicated, but they're actually not that difficult to use. So what we're supposed to be focusing on here are these special on-expand and on-collapse triggers. The on-expand and on-collapse are typically used with dynamic tree views. So that tells us that there's really two types of tree views with display array. We have static tree views, where the tree is loaded up with data before the dialog starts, and then you have dynamic tree views, which are filled on demand by using these on-expand, on-collapse triggers. So very similar to what we looked at with paged mode. The idea here is to save on traffic to the front end when we get ready to do a display array. We don't want to send a lot of data over if we don't need it. And also, of course, it saves on memory as well. If we have this huge amount of data or huge number of rows to show, there may be memory issues or, let's say, lapse in time to actually get all that data preloaded before we can actually start the display array. So it saves on memory, saves on traffic to use these dynamic tree views. And the key to using dynamic tree views, to just loading the data on demand, is this on-expand and on-collapse syntax. So that's typically what it's used for, to dynamically add nodes to a dynamic array when you get ready to display the data. Again, if the user expands a node in the tree, that would trigger the on-expand, so it would go and fetch more rows. And if the user collapses a node in the tree, you can actually use this on-collapse syntax to add code to go in and delete nodes from the dynamic array. We'll be looking at the display array statement along with the tree views, for example, and paged array display in a later session that we have. If you're interested, we have a whole session on arrays on the 28th of August. So we'll be talking about arrays there, and we'll get into this in more detail. So if you're interested in arrays and how to implement this tree view or the paged mode, you might want to attend that session or view the recording later. Okay, so now we're moving on to the next interactive dialogue statement. The input just supports data entry into the field of the current form, whatever the current form is. Here we're using this, grab my highlighter here, the input by name syntax. What else are we supposed to look at here? Oh, in bold, the onChange. So there's the onChange block, and it's fairly self-explanatory. The onChange block actually gets triggered when a user is leaving a field. So in this case, if he's gone in and edited the store name or changed the store name, that will trigger this onChange control block when he leaves the field and goes on to the next field. Now, if you're using something a little different than just a plain old edit field, let's say it's a radio group, a combo box, spin edit, slider, checkbox. The onChange blocks for those are actually invoked immediately, as soon as the user changes the value. But for an edit field, it actually is triggered when he leaves the field and moves on to the next field. So you can specify what you want to do in the case of a user changing a specific field, like store name in this case. Here they're just saying, well, if there's been a change and the store name is null, we're going to give them an error and send them right back in there to fix it. We can't have a null store name. So that's onChange. Also notice we've got an onIdle and an onAction. Those are statements that you can use or clauses that you can use in the input as well, and we've seen some examples of those. So I won't demo them to you. Oh, I almost missed this one down at the bottom. Field order form. That field order form is what they call a control attribute. All it's saying is that the tabbing order of the fields, as a user tabs through the fields and goes from field to field, is actually determined by a tab index attribute that you can specify in your form. So you would go to the form to look for that, and you can specify the tabbing order there, and that's what they call the tab index attribute. So it's in the attributes section of the form. So the default order, if we didn't have that field order form option, the default would just be the field to field that we have in the screen array, just by the order of the variables that you have. So whatever variables you have, the order that those variables are in, it would just go from field to field in the screen array based on the order of the variable, the program variables. Okay, so we're moving on to input array. And input array, we talked about earlier, allows your users to go in and edit. They can delete existing rows, edit existing rows, insert new rows, move around inside of a list of records in the array. And for input array, excuse me, we have onIdle and onAction that we've seen a few times before. But we've also got some additional control blocks. We've got before delete, after delete, cancel delete. If we're not happy with what's going on, we can cancel out of the delete. We've got before and after insert and a cancel insert as well. So an example we have here on the screen, here's an input array. We're using before delete. So there we're going in and deleting from items where the item is equal to the current array item number, current array element item number. And if there's a problem, we're going to give them an error. And then we've got the cancel delete option here to cancel out of the delete. All right, that after delete, where did it go here? There it is. The after delete is executed after the row's been deleted. And of course, the before delete that we're using in our example is executed every time the user deletes a row, but before the row is removed from the list. So most of the time people use this before delete to actually go in and do the update on the actual database table. Right? When a row gets deleted, we use that to go in and actually delete the database row. Okay. Here's the on change and on row change. Now we've seen the on change already. Get my highlighter going again. Right, this on change works the same way as it does with the input instruction that we looked at a few slides ago. So remember, the on change is triggered when the user leaves a field, except in the case where you're using something other than an edit field. So if you're using a radio group, combo box, spin edit, and so on, that gets invoked immediately or triggered immediately when the user makes the change. But for a regular edit field, it's when the user leaves the field. Now the on row change, we see here with the input array, is executed when the user moves to a whole different row, not just a different field in a particular row. So after modifications have been done and they're moving on, that's when the on row change gets triggered. So again, this control block in an input array is usually used to go ahead and synchronize the database, to go in and update the database with the changes. So on change, on row change. And then here's input array. So a lot of the new options with input array are going to be familiar too. We've got the accept, get my highlighter, cancel, insert, there's an insert row, sorry, delete row. So a lot of those are probably familiar to you, but there might be a few things here that are not familiar, like this auto append option and keep current row option. Now what all of these are actually predefined options that we're looking at. So VDL predefines some actions and then the names associated with those actions, like accept or cancel. You're probably familiar with those. Well, there's some additional predefined actions for input array, and that's what we're seeing here. There's not just accept and cancel, but we've got append row, insert row, delete row. Those are all predefined actions. Now this auto append actually is used to create a new temporary row automatically. About the only time you would see that is the case where a user might go in and delete the last item in a list, for example. It would create a temporary row automatically, so we wouldn't have just an empty list. This keep current row, you might not be familiar with it. The keep current row just more or less enforces that the current row stay highlighted even when we leave the dialog, in this case the input array dialog. So what these are, this accept, cancel, append, all these attributes are ways that you can disable or turn off these default predefined actions. So if you don't want them to be invoked or take place, you can go in and use these attributes to turn them off. Like in this case up here at the top, attributes insert row equal false, so it won't automatically insert a row, new row right before the current row when the user fills the record. You can say cancel equal false in the attributes to prevent it from creating that default cancel action that you usually get when you have an input array. So these are ways that you can turn these on and off if you want to. Okay, so that looks like the story for all the interactive dialogues. And we have just a few pages left here on a different topic. It's related, but it's a little different, about multiple dialogues. Before I get started with multiple dialogues, does anybody have any questions or comments about just the singular dialogues that we've been looking at up to this point? Okay, well, let's go ahead and look at multiple dialogues, or the multiple dialogue feature. All right, so multiple dialogues allow a Genero program to handle multiple interactive dialogues all at the same time, or run them in parallel, I guess you could say, which means that multiple interactive statements, like in this example, input, construct, display array, can all be active and, let's say, open to the user all at the same time. And that's not a typical thing, actually, with 4GL programming. So typically we have to accept or cancel out of one dialog before we can move on into another dialog. But with this multiple dialog feature, you can actually have the input, in this example, the construct, and the display array all active and available to the user at the same time. He can move around freely in that form to handle data entry. So even though one part might be controlled by an input statement, another part might be controlled by an input array, he can move back and forth freely between those two dialogues. In this case, it would be 3 dialogues in our example. So this is what some example code might look like to implement this multiple dialogue feature. So we have a keyword dialog that we see up here at the top. Get my highlighter. So this is our keyword dialog, and you can think of it as, let's say, a parent dialog might be a good way to think of it. He's a parent for all of these other interactive dialog statements like display array and display array in this example. So here we've got 2 different display arrays. They're going to be open or active at the same time, and the user is going to be able to move between these 2 display arrays without having to first accept or cancel out of the first display array. So one thing you'll notice here is that we use dialog a lot of different ways. So we use the word dialog to describe all the interactive instructions that we just went through in the session: construct, menu, input array. So we use the term dialog for all of those. And we also use the dialog keyword, like we see here, to implement this multiple dialog feature. And if you were in the session a few weeks ago on the built-in classes, you're familiar with the ui.dialog class that we can use that has methods that can be used with interactive dialogues. We even saw a menu style called dialog today in our menu interactive dialog statement. So we use the word dialog in lots of different places, so I know it gets a little bit confusing. So in this case, we've got this dialog keyword, and we can think of it like a parent interactive instruction, and these 2 display array statements are nested inside this parent dialog, and it has more or less overriding control of these dialogues, and they're both active or open at the same time. Excuse me. Something else you can do with dialogs is, this keyword dialog, is pass a dialog object to a function. So when you do this, this dialog is passed as a reference. Here's a good example in a menu dialog. So we've got before menu, we're calling a function, and we're passing a reference to this current menu dialog to the setup actions function. And then down here in the setup actions function, here's where we passed in our dialog object. We've defined a variable D as a ui.dialog object. And what we're doing here is just using this function to enable and disable some actions. So maybe we have some actions that we want to be available to the user during the menu dialog, and maybe we have some actions that we don't want to be available to the user in this dialog. So we're using a setup actions function and then a reference to the current dialog to actually enable and disable these different actions. So notice we just mentioned the special ui.dialog class, and here we see some examples of it. Right? This set action active is a method that we have in our ui.dialog class. So notice we didn't have to do anything fancy to use that reference to the current interactive dialog. We didn't have to go in and use, let's say, a class method or anything of that nature to get a reference to the current interactive dialog. We just had to use this dialog keyword. That's all we had to do. So it's very convenient and easy to use. And then finally, since we were talking about the ui.dialog class, we're ending our presentation with just a page on the ui.dialog class. So this is the class we've been talking about that has a lot of methods that we can use with the interactive dialog statements, just like the one we saw a minute ago to make an action active or disable an action based on methods we use. Okay. Well, that was a fairly short session today. I think it was exactly 1 hour. I have 2 o'clock Eastern time. I have noon here in Dallas. So I think that was exactly an hour today. Get rid of this highlighter real quick. Okay, so that was our discussion on interactive dialogues and a little information on the multiple dialogue feature. So the recording will be, or the session will be recorded. So if you missed any of it or if there were audio problems, hopefully the audio will be a little bit better in the recording and you'll be able to pick up anything that you might have missed there when I was leaning forward so I could see things on the screen a bit better. So thank you very much for attending the session. I really appreciate you guys coming. It's nice to see familiar names, and it's also very nice to see new names as well. So I'll have the recording posted later this afternoon. And again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send me an email at lchildress@4jays.com. And in the meantime, I'll just plan to hopefully see you guys again in 2 weeks. Thank you.